Thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon to the second session of the Epistemologies of Land webcast series, sponsored by the Center for Global Knowledge Studies, GLONOS, and Crash in Cambridge. After our great first session with Sakshi, we will today hear from Eloisa Berman-Arévalo from the Department of History and Social Sciences at Universidad del Norte in Barranquilla, Colombia. Eloisa has a PhD in geography from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And her talk today is entitled Stories at Land's End, Emplacements and Displacements of Black Women's Land Epistemologies in the Colombian Caribbean. Thank you so much, Eloisa, for joining us. I know the situation in Colombia currently is quite bleak in terms of the corona pandemic, and given childcare and everything, I know you're very busy, and therefore thank you very much also for writing a great paper and for joining us here and presenting your research to us. I'm looking forward to hear what you have to say. And as with Sakshi's talk, we have about 20-25 minutes, and then we have enough time for common discussion. So thanks again, and the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Felix, Samantha, and all the staff that has made this possible. And thank you for this invitation, not only to speak today, but to join this wonderful group around this interesting topic of land epistemologies. I'm very excited to participate and to hear everybody's interventions as well. So today I will present a paper that is based on several years of research and collaboration among afro-descendant communities in the Colombian Caribbean, particularly in an agrarian region called Montes de Maria. I'm going to share my screen because I want to show you, at the very least, show you a map. I'm a geographer, as Felix said, and we cannot avoid maps, although we criticize them all the time for being colonial, but we do it anyway. So here's a map. This is the Colombian Caribbean region, northern Colombia, right? And I'm right here in Barranquilla, which is the largest city of the region. It's not on the map. And Montes de Maria is this mountainous region right here, very close to Cartagena, which is the capital city of that state. I will later present some pictures, but for now, I'll stop sharing. So, hold on. Okay. Particularly, I work in a municipality called Maria la Baja, which is 97% Afro-descendant population. This is a historically Afro-campesino territory, and for those of you who are familiar with discussions on agrarian studies in Latin America, the term campesino, although it's translated as peasant, has a slightly different meaning. It goes beyond a class-based category and includes cultural questions, geographic questions, and a connection to the land and rural life. So this is a historically Afro-campesino territory that is born out of centuries of maroonage of enslaved persons that escaped the port of Cartagena and created, through the centuries, configured Afro-campesino economies, ways of life, and territory. However, in the past 50 years, rural life has changed dramatically in this area. Agrarian reform in the late 1960s and 70s inserted local populations in schemes and logics of agrarian modernization, commercial agriculture, and state recognition as peasants, which dismissed Black communities' traditional knowledges and social natural relations and territorial dynamics. Starting in the late 1980s, armed conflict between left-wing guerrillas, right-wing paramilitaries, and the Colombian military generated massive displacement from the fields where people live to the small towns and to large cities, regional capitals, and also generated very violent land politics, which culminated tragically in massive displacement and in the installation of large-scale oil palm plantations, which have expanded really dramatically over the past 20 years and obviously condition today rural inhabitants' everyday lives and geographies. Let me show you again a picture of what this looks like. This is a sort of dramatic picture because it was taken with a drone. And this is a small village in the area. And what you see around here is all oil palm plantations, right? So it's really the plantation encroaching upon people's everyday spaces. Oh, hold on. Okay. So I start with these moments of the region's agrarian history because, oh, hold on, I'm having problems here with my screen. Just a minute. Because I conceive these different moments as iterations of what Catherine McKittrick, one of the leading scholars in the field of Black geographies, understands as the geographic domination of Black lives. McKittrick work situates epistemology as a cornerstone for understanding an ongoing project of geographic domination, which manifests materially as a dispossession, displacement, and confinement of Black bodies and territories. And it has to do with epistemology because a perspective of transparent space, a space that is abstract and is pre-given other than socially constructed and experienced, renders Black people as ungeographic. That is, it's an epistemological perspective that doesn't engage the contestations involved in the social construction of space and thereby reproduces domination by invisibilizing the geographic experiences, practices, knowledges, imaginations of Black subjects. So this question of how epistemic hierarchies enable the erasure of the geographies of Black life is present in my work. It haunts my work. As a geographer that claims to practice critical ethnography with a feminist and decolonial perspective, I'm constantly troubled by the impossibility of ethnography escaping its colonial foundations. My own research is enabled by social, racial, geographic privilege as an urban mestiza woman, educated in the University of the Global North and working currently at a private university in a regional capital. However, although practices of theoretical abstraction and translation are unavoidable and problematic, I believe, like others participating in a project of decolonial geographies, that certain forms of academic knowledge production can contribute to decolonial struggles, particularly epistemic political struggles. And this can happen by creating alternative narratives that, and I'm going to quote McKittrick, make visible social lives which are rendered ungeographically. This is not disconnected to a broader project of decolonial geographies, of affirmative refusal of a racialized political economy of containment, displacement, and violence. And I'm quoting here Michelle Daigle and Maggie Ramirez, were young scholars that are really at the forefront of this field of Black geographies in North America. If the decolonial is a political project that resists gendered and racialized interconnected violences and the mundane and practical ways in which they are reproduced, then to strive for decolonial academic practice involves naming and dismantling the pervasive violence of epistemic erasure and creating alternative narratives where the experiences, knowledges, politics of subalternized subjects is central. And this is why I'm particularly interested in women's everyday stories and storytelling as forms of knowledge making that are deeply political. Stories, or the kind of stories that I'm talking about, are narrated through an epistemological register that foregrounds ordinary life, where the ordinary is an epistemological register. So in that sense, stories may appear as anecdotal or as gossip, yet they're narrating histories, geographies, and racialized and gendered agrarian political economies through the lens of ordinary life events. Particularly in the case of women's everyday stories, through the gendered everyday practices of care and social reproduction. Stories not only express detailed geographic knowledge, but as I argue in this paper, also configure a politics of claiming land and territory. Of course, stories like space are not transparent either, right? So as an ethnography, I'm not aiming at an accurate translation of these stories or at making them visible or making visible pre-existent land epistemologies. Rather, ethnographic rendering allows me to participate in the creation of stories as I attempt to co-create narratives that foreground the geographic knowledge and experience produced by and accountable to the people with whom I work. My contribution as an academic to these stories is further to emphasize their decolonial political possibilities as they attempt to keep alive, recreate, and reclaim Black geographic existence in context of racialized dispossession. My computer just told me that my internet is unstable, so please let me know if you can't hear me well, and I can
We hear you quite well.
Hopefully fix this. Okay, thank you. So as I suggest in the title, which I realized as I wrote the paper, either you write these titles and write the abstracts and they sound great. And then when it comes to writing the paper, I realize it's a very ambitious title. But as I suggest in the title, this talk is a reflection on the situated nature of land epistemologies, both in a temporal and a geographic sense. And I use Tanya Murray Lee's notion of Land's End. That's where this idea of Land's End comes from Tanya Murray Lee's book, to refer to a specific spatial temporal conjuncture in which Black campesino communities are facing the effects of over 20 years of piecemeal dispossession, which has been accompanied by the enclosure of common use fields, woods and water wells, and increasingly also by the contamination of soils and water sources. So this land then it's a conjuncture which is spatial and also temporal. It has to do with this realization of the effects of this process today. It's also, in that sense, an affective moment, which is marked by a sense of imminent demise of the land and by the uncertainty around the future of life in this place. I'm particularly interested in how this end-place conjuncture makes women's stories of walking or inhabiting the land political actions. So I'm going to start with a short story told by my friend and collaborator, Sofia, in a small village where I work called Palo Altico. We who were knowers of the land. How we used to walk these lands. Marisela and Mercedes would walk all the way to Colu and back, selling fish with their bowls on their heads. One day, Marisela and I got lost. I said that was witchcraft or something. We who are knowers of this land couldn't find our way out of the bush. I don't know how we ended up in those woods. We saw a white bearded man taking a bath in a ditch. Next to him was a female dog. When he saw us, he started laughing and laughing nonstop. I know everyone around here, and I'd never seen that man. So we started running. We were lost for hours and arrived at night. That was God who brought us back. Imagine us carrying those bowls and stuck in the bush, surrounded by thorns. We, knowers of the land, could not find our way out. And I got to say that the translation to English sort of takes away all the fun of the story because it's narrated with a very particular rhythm and accent that is also part of its meaning or shapes the meaning. But I do my best to translate it. So Sophia's story, which was told in the presence of her children and 3 other women, including myself, is rich with symbolism and meaning. References to white bearded men as demons are recurrent in Afro-Latin American oral traditions, often associated with disputed lands, malevolent landowners, and relations of exploitation. This is something that Michael Tausig writes about. In turn, her emphasis on being knowers of the land not only reinforces the idea that more than human forces must have been necessary for them to lose their way home, but is central to the broader meaning of her story. Her story is a claim of times past. It's humorous and it's nostalgic at the same time. It's about the changing conditions of land use, land access, and social relations that make it increasingly difficult for women to walk the land as they used to. In this sense, to claim to be knowers of the land becomes a claim to land itself, given that this quality can only be realized through walking, using, or inhabiting the land. Anishinaabeg indigenous scholar and activist Leanne Simpson, which Sakshmi also talked about it in her presentation, and it'd be great to have a conversation around how we use her work. She writes about land as pedagogy, conceiving land as the condition of possibility for indigenous learning to occur. Land is both context and the process of learning itself. Indigenous epistemology is not only deeply relational, rooted in intersubjective relations with the non-human, but clearly emplaced. Developed in the context of ongoing settler colonialism and dispossession, Leanne Simpson's work is an invitation to grapple with difficult questions around the relationship between place, land epistemology, and politics. How can we speak of land epistemologies if land is under threat, or in the case of Leanne Simpson, no longer available? How do land-based epistemologies become political in the face of dispossession? And what is the role of place in shaping the political potential of land epistemologies? I'm going to reflect on these questions in what follows based on another story. This time it's a story of a place called Leticia. And Leticia is a village water well that for years was women's favorite gathering place. Leticia was not only a place of fetching water, but it was a place of sociability, of relaxation, and of storytelling. So knowledge making in Leticia was a collective practice that was very much situated in the material, the symbolic, the affective, and the social conditions of a place that, as we will see, was coming to an end. Okay, here's another story. Felix, if you could let me know maybe how I'm doing with time, because I'm afraid it's going to be.
You're doing just all right. Don't worry.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So here's the story of Leticia. Against my initial assumptions, as I heard women speak about Leticia was not a woman. It was a water well. Its name was symbolic of the relationship between women and the spaces of everyday social reproduction in agrarian settings. As the story goes, many years ago, a woman from the neighboring town of Playón named Leticia, the woman who was named Leticia, discovered the well while harvesting rice in the neighboring fields. After realizing she had forgotten her bucket of water, Leticia walked and walked until she encountered the spring's humid walls. She was so thirsty that she dug and dug until the spring started crying crystal clear waters. Upon her return to Playón, Leticia told others in the community about the well's existence. They decided to name it after the woman who had discovered it with great effort as she walked the land. Located about 1 kilometer away from the village of Palo Altico and surrounded by palm oil plantations, Leticia was clearly under threat. The well lay on lands that had once been claimed by the village's local land occupation committee, but after the advent of paramilitary violence, the land was claimed by a new landowner who immediately planted oil palm. The new owner of the lands allowed locals to continue using the spring, but it was clear that their presence was unwelcome. Soon after its privatization, fencing was reinforced, and every so often, plantation security guards would leave garbage in its waters in order to dissuade women from using it. Palm roots now covered the spring's natural walls and dried out its water, which everyone knew must be contaminated by the heavy use of pesticides in surrounding fields. Once measuring 2 meters in diameter, Leticia was now less than half its original size. The majority of the trees that had surrounded the well, which everyone knew were fundamental for its replenishment, had been cut down for the establishment of palm oil trees. It was clear that this important space of stories and social life would soon disappear. And I'm going to show you a picture of Leticia. Just a minute, because I think that really helps in imagining what I'm talking about. Just a minute. So hold on. So this is these are women Here's Luz Maria, Sofia, Argelia. They're talking, telling stories, and the spring this is part of the spring, sort of a crack, un arroyo, a stream that comes out of the spring itself. And these are all palm oil trees around it. And then this is the well itself. Imagine it was already in these conditions. And these right here are roots of the palm oil trees that are completely eating it up, literally. Okay. Go back. Just a minute. Hold on. On my first visit to Leticia, and I went to the Leticia many times for the year that I lived in the community. Tia Luz Maria, who was 65, was the lively protagonist of that day's storytelling. Speaking about the place, she told us, imagine when we first started coming here, it was Eloisa, and this is another Eloisa, a local Eloisa, Margarita, Pocho, a bunch of us young women cutting Creole palm and timber, not this industrial palm, no, but the Creole one, the kind that we use for our hair or for making the brooms. Right here is where my dad had his plot, right here in this piece of land we're sitting on. First, he would plant corn, then rice and more rice, and higher up, he planted plantain. And further on was Carlitos Blanco's plot, then Danielito's plot. This was amazing. All of this was rice fields. It was really pretty before. She went on to talk about her adventures as a young woman. She and her friends would spend hours in the bush gathering oil and timber, fishing in the small springs, or cutting rice. And again, this is Luz Maria's voice. We were brave. We went anywhere in the bush. We weren't scared of nothing. That's why one time I was attacked by the African bees. I was walking with Sylvia's son and I saw those beetles. I tell you, I took off so fast, I don't know where I left my sandals. We arrived at a lemon tree, and let me tell you, I'm looking at all those lemons, wondering how I'm going to reach them. And another African bee flies over my head and stings me on the back. Oh man, I'm telling you, I had to spend all night taking out all that sting. It's not that I didn't like the house, but I liked walking, being out here. When we went out to cut rice, we spent all day here. We really enjoyed it. After 2 or so in the afternoon, we'd go back home. We went out walking, Aunt Dominga, Mama, Francisca, Ida. It was a lot of women. We brought our water buckets, our cigarettes, and we talked and talked. Cutting rice was hard work, but we made it fun. We tended a cloth further on by the rice fields, and when the rice was cut, we stepped on it and cleaned it, laughing and talking and telling stories. Stories like Luz Maria's were told in Leticia on a daily basis, often in the form of collective conversations. The experience of Leticia's imminent end and the symbolic and material conditions of land in these circumstances shaped the knowledge practices that occurred in and with this place. Here, as in Leanne Simpson's work, place was not only an in-place locale, but a set of social and social natural relations where water, the material basis of life itself, was entangled with gendered sociabilities and knowledges and sedimented layers of racialized dispossession. Placing land epistemologies in Leticia allows us to reflect on epistemologies as collective political practices that are configured in relation to the concrete, yet multidimensional and multitemporal conditions of place. Leticia brings to the fore the importance of considering the materiality of contamination, erosion, or enclosure, as this materiality, as part of land itself, participates in this relational knowledge making. Leticia's dire physical conditions were constant reference points in stories as women complained about its drying waters and speculated about future alternatives for accessing clear water. Materiality was a crass reminder that dispossession, although in certain ways piecemeal and everyday and normalized sometimes, we can talk about this later, was a matter of physical survival. Further, the experience of collectively witnessing the slow death of a place that was so central for both physical survival and women's everyday social life imbued stories in Leticia with an affective dimension marked by anguish and uncertainty, and at the same time by joy and nostalgia as women evoked memories of past rural life, walking the land. Symbolically, Leticia had been the possibility of creating cracks of Black social life within a territorial regime that was based on erasure, expulsion, and exclusion. For Black women in particular, and it's important here to have this intersectional approach of not only race, but gender as well. For Black women in particular, it was also the possibility of experiencing care and social reproduction as practices of freedom, nurturance, enjoyment, and collective knowledge making. At the same time, its demise materialized the layered oppressions that enabled its current state: structural racism and its epistemic erasures, the devaluation of Black life, the impossibility of being heard. It is against this backdrop that stories decidedly repositioned women as geographic agents with epistemic authority. The constant references in stories to being knowers of the land and walkers of the land reflected a particular political stance towards the current situation. As argued by Carolyn Finney, who is an African-American geography that works in the North American South, writing, in place stories of land were a way of saying we were here and we are here now. Finally, land epistemologies in Leticia conjugated multiple and entangled temporalities. And I think this is really interesting when we talk about land epistemologies, to think also about the temporal dimension of land epistemologies. Histories of racialized dispossession that were written on the land, an evocation of a past of land-based social life, the slowness of the well's death, and a sense of uncertainty about the future. These different temporalities operated simultaneously and shaped the contents, the form, and the register, epistemological register of stories. In my dissertation, which I wrote some years ago now, I argue that in the context of the spatial exclusions of agro-capitalist expansion, stories are profoundly territorial. Stories in Leticia recognized the well as a disputed territory and made Leticia a site of Black women's territoriality. They revealed the ways in which women's everyday practices produced alternative territories by inhabiting the land through everyday movements, socialities, and agrarian practices, symbolically and materially transforming spaces where dominant territorial regimes would otherwise limit local spatial agencies. On the other hand, stories themselves produced territory. They inscribed women's personal histories onto contemporary spaces of exclusion. Through the epistemological register of the ordinary, this threatened space was inscribed with the familiar, thereby enabling women to claim protagonism as geographic agents and reclaim Leticia as their own. So stories were, in this sense, were spatial political practices. I'm going to try to go on. Okay. So first, in the end of this paper, in this last part of the paper, I'm going to speak about the question of displaced land epistemologies and how Leticia ended. Towards the end of 2015, I was informed that Leticia had, in fact, disappeared. While women's stories had preemptively responded to its imminent demise, what followed after its physical disappearance was silence. The silence could be interpreted as a sign of passivity or acquiescence, as people perhaps grew accustomed to loss and to injustice. But surely a post facto reaction was limited, among other things, because the well itself has disappeared. The well as a place of politics had disappeared. So this limits also the possibility of politics itself. Rather than suggesting a tragic end to land-based epistemologies, Leticias End opens important questions and invites creative political alternatives. What happens to land epistemologies and to their politics when the places of knowledge making are no longer available? Here, Leanne Simpson again offers important insights, because Simpson's is not only a statement on the importance of land for Anishinaabeg intelligence, she's also offering a political horizon for what she calls cultural resurgence based on the recreations of the conditions in which indigenous learning occurred. So she's writing in the context of the very real effects of settler colonial dispossession in Canada, which implies that many indigenous people now live in urban settings and are away from their stolen lands. Under these conditions, recreating indigenous land epistemologies requires challenging settler colonial spatial ontologies. This is Leanne Simpson speaking. That fix place onto location, and in her words, dissect our territories and our bodies into reserved city, rural, urban dichotomy. So it's interesting what Simpson is saying, because she's saying we have to recreate the conditions so that indigenous learning can be emplaced again, but we have to do that in the context of displacement, right? So how can that happen? And one of the things she talks about, and which is central, is reimagining this geographic concepts themselves, right? So place, for example, is understood expansively, for the land is inseparable from the context of family, community, and relations. So by recreating the latter, family, community, relations, it becomes possible to in turn recreate emplaced epistemologies, even in urban contexts, while reclaiming stolen lands. Although it might seem utopic, right? And I think this is part of her work. Simpson opens political avenues, which are not free, obviously, of important challenges. In this case, in the case of Black campesino communities, these challenges have to do with the importance of material places in enabling sociabilities and relations. These places must be recreated and reimagined under the current conditions. This is in fact occurring as kitchens, backyards, and other spaces of everyday life gain more importance for women's sociabilities and knowledge making. The second challenge, which is perhaps more difficult, has to do with the fact that, as Veronica Gago writes, agrarian extractivism must be understood also in an expansive sense. It's not only physical resources that are extracted in agrarian extractivism, but also communal relations and collective solidarities. So we're talking also about a moment in which this insertion into agro-capitalist relations is also eroding relations of solidarity and the communal living. Despite these challenges, women in the community are actively recreating places and practices of collective work and solidarity. While the effects of precarity and dispossession make everyday life increasingly challenging, stories of life with the land continue to be told, resisting displacement while suffering its effects. And I'm going to end briefly with a reflection on how our work enters into this constellation. The colonial geographers, Michelle Daigle and Maggie Ramirez, proposed the idea of constellations in formation as a spatial concept that highlights the interconnected character of ongoing decolonial struggles. Constellations, they write, are information all around us, re-envisioning and re-embodying a politics of place by interweaving spatial practices of resistance, refusal, and liberation. The case of Black communities in Montes de Maria, the recreation of place-based land epistemologies increasingly involves this creative reconstruction of a politics of place. It's a multi-sided process involving individuals now living in urban settings, others living in the village with little access to land, others who with great effort manage to still walk the land, as well as a set of external actors like academics and NGO representatives who also participate in these struggles. The role of academics is particularly relevant precisely because of its potential to call attention to land-based knowledge practices and propose epistemic conversations in which Black campesino knowledges are engaged as political, theoretical, and transformative practices. And I'm going to end with a short story to highlight the storied character of this talk on how my own knowledge production entered into a productive constellation in formation through cyberspace. A couple of weeks ago, I was tagged on 3 posts on Facebook made by my friend Duban. Duban, who's 24, is from the town of Palo Altico. He was able to study audiovisual production in the state capital, Cartagena, and currently lives in a regional city on Colombia's Caribbean coast, though he visits his hometown regularly. He and I are members of a collective that thinks through questions of land and social justice in Maria La Baja. To my surprise, Duan had posted on his Facebook page excerpts of an article published in 2019 where I discussed Black refusal to state-led agrarian reform in the 1970s. Based largely on the memories and knowledges of village elders, I refuted the idea that locals had rejected land titling based on their ignorance or their docility. Duban's grandfather and great-grandmother were quoted extensively in the excerpts posted on his Facebook page. Perhaps for this reason, and because he understood the article's political purpose, he also tagged his 8 siblings and cousins on his post. I'm unsure of what happened next, but I assume that at the very least, they read it and commented on it. This minor cyber event may seem inconsequential, yet it speaks of how academia participates in the translation of place-based land epistemologies. These translations can become politically productive conversations that can travel out of the community into academic circles, to cyberspace, and be re-emplaced as they reach younger generations through cyberspace. These two are contemporary emplacements and displacements of land epistemologies, whose politics can be rerouted to support the struggle for Black land, territory, and rural life. And with that, I end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eloisa. That was very insightful, and also for a Friday afternoon, which it is in my case, very entertaining through all the stories. So thank you very, very much for that.